Welcome to Praxis. I'm Olivia Rousset. I'd like to welcome our audience here in Sydney, as well as those watching on APAC, online, or listening on radio, and a special welcome to our live audience in Port Moresby and Dili. Today we'll be discussing climate change and international development. Throughout the discussion, I'll invite questions from the audience. On our panel today, we have Norman Gillespie, the Chief Executive of UNICEF Australia, Milina Battaglini. Milina's the Senior Environmental Specialist at the World Bank Pacific Department, and Martijn Wilder, who is the Head of Global Environmental Markets and Climate Change at the law firm Baker and McKenzie. People in developing countries will bear up to 80% of the costs of damage caused by the changing climate. A rise in temperatures, rain patterns, sea levels, and more frequent and severe natural disasters threaten food, agriculture, and water supplies, making it all the more difficult for people in these countries to escape poverty. Climate change potentially makes every one of the Millennium Development Goals less achievable. Norman, I'd like to start with you. Can you, when we think of UNICEF, we normally don't think of climate change as being something in your domain. Can you tell me about where UNICEF connects with climate change?
Yes, Olivia. The two are not, as you say, natural partners, and yet the consequences of climate change are exactly what we're about. UNICEF clearly approaches everything from the perspective of children and the impact on issues and situations on those children and how to mitigate them. Quite simply, children are the most vulnerable people on the planet in the circumstances of extreme weather or climate change. Yet, we don't see a lot of research or a lot of connection between the climate change debate and the impact on children. So UNICEF are very conscious about getting more evidence for this, getting more evidence-based analysis from countries to actually measure the effect that it is having. And as you mentioned the Millennium Development Goals, it's very timely that today in New York, these are being discussed. The Secretary General has brought together all the developing countries to say, look, we've got 5 years to go. We've made a certain amount of progress, but actually some of these targets are still looking pretty far out there. What the consequences of climate change are doing, as you say, is rolling back the progress that's been made, particularly in smaller nations. And what we're seeing are the consequences of that in terms of extreme poverty. And we are now really trying to get in at the grassroots level to start working with communities at a very low level, to start educating and to start preparing. But overall, it's to try to get the attention of governments to look at a more integrated approach to what is going to be a very long-term, slow burn emergency, is how I describe it, frankly, with the effects of climate change on children.
You've got, in developing countries, there are so many other issues going on. I imagine it's quite hard to focus the government's attention away from things like healthcare or education or sanitation, say, no, you need to look at this as connected. Can you talk about how you...
You do, but look, governments tend to look at short-term programs. This is a long-term program, and I think things that are happening to children in the first 5 years of their lives are going to have a consequence for that whole generation. So it is acting now to realise that these are the most vulnerable people, that they are going to create, the climate change is going to create some of the social dynamics that we're trying to really tackle in other countries during the MDGs. So I'll give you a couple of examples. So you've got Kiribati in the Pacific, where you wouldn't normally make a connection between, say, climate change and sexual exploitation. But because of the effects of poverty, because their crops have been ruined through salination, families really have no income, and the first in that situation to be exploited really are the girls. And if the girls were in education, they're taken out of education. It's either child labour or it's prostitution. We're seeing also in other nation states where the displacement of the population through poverty, again, is causing social disruption. So I think we need to understand the effect and impact of these extreme weather conditions. We're noticing a great prevalence. Clearly, we've got Pakistan right on our focus at the moment. The extent of that is incomprehensible. I don't think people really have grasped that yet. And therefore, today you see the UN coming out, or UNICEF coming out with a further appeal for funds. But you see the reality then of water, sanitation, hygiene, vaccination actually coming to the fore. Well, that's happening on a smaller scale to many smaller nations, especially on the doorstep of Australia.
You were in Cambodia a couple of weeks ago, and you mentioned that the children there were being quite active in getting their message
Yes,
out.
and that's an important factor for UNICEF, giving children a voice. So we were in Cambodia, again, looking at sanitation and hygiene issues. And it was really heartening there to see and join in with, in fact, the kids from the villages, literally parading through with megaphones and placards, encouraging the adults to think about latrines and washing your hands and all of those very basic things. So we've got to give them a voice in the climate debate as well as to what is happening and how they can understand that and get it through to the rest of the population of what must be done. Otherwise, they are going to suffer, and they are suffering. There's 100 million children in the Asia-Pacific region who are suffering from stunted growth, and that comes through poor diet. We saw that in Cambodia a lot. I was sitting beside one young bright chap in his school, hand going up, fantastic English. I thought he was 9 years old. He was 16. And this has consequences for their whole lives, and has consequences for the social fabric of that country. So we've got to make that connection between getting the right plans in place to mitigate what is going to happen, what is happening.
Do you in your work, do you differentiate between natural disasters and climate change?
I don't think it's useful to do that, other than to say natural disasters clearly get the attention of the public. They are, in a way, sexy. According to how much airspace it gets on television or radio, people will react, and Australians react marvellously well when they do know. But when there are smaller nations on your doorstep suffering from the very same issues, not getting that airtime, yes, I think there's a lot of donor and compassionate fatigue and a lack of understanding in that.
Can you draw a couple of examples of the lives of children who are dealing with these impacts, or children you've met? You mentioned the guy in the school, but in the family, the full family dynamic, from how their livelihood might be affected to...
It really does come down to incomes. And so, for instance, in Cambodia, there's a very encouraging statistic that 95% of children are now at least attending primary school, and that is one of the fundamental issues in the Convention of Rights for Children, universal education. And there's gender equality. That's terrific. However, the girls are the first to be taken away if a family suffers deprivation through whatever income decline. And the girls are taken out, and the girls are made to work. So, you know, it's 2 steps forward and 1 step backwards, really. But don't be under any illusion. Families do have to survive and do have to live, and that's why they revert to extreme circumstances in sex trafficking and prostitution and other very disturbing features of otherwise developing, you know, countries who have got the right idea. So look, children are the future. Children are the voice. We've got to educate both them because they're going to become mothers, for instance, and the way they tackle motherhood and maternity is going to be very important to that society. But what is encouraging, and I'll be interested in the rest of the panel referring to this, is the programs are not mega government programs coming down. They're now programs coming up from the grassroots by creating these small commune councils, because it's those people who understand where the poorest families are or where particular circumstances may force them into. So we find that most encouraging, and of course we advise, we work, we put funding that way. And just to see the mothers taking command of the situation and bringing the children in for vaccination means something is happening on the ground. But however, when you have a natural disaster come through, all that gets wiped away so quickly. That's disturbing.
Milina, you talked a bit about, you can talk to the same thing a little bit about the impact on the economic situation, on the loss of GDP in countries like this. Could you add to that a bit?
Yes, there are a lot of points that Norman raised that connect quite a bit with the work we are doing, and our focus is really on the Pacific Island countries and how vulnerable they are to climate change, and the need to devise responses to the impact of climate change, what we call climate change adaptation. The Pacific Island countries, however, are also very vulnerable to natural disasters. So that connection is there. And is even more so if we think that climate change impacts are going to exacerbate the challenges that natural disasters are already posing to these countries. And while in absolute terms, the news of disasters in small countries never makes it to, to the front page, the relative numbers are actually quite significant. In worst years of disasters, some of Pacific Island countries have damages in terms of GDP loss up to 40, 50, 100%. And in terms of population affected by these disasters, natural or climate related, we can reach 50% of the population. This is incredible and is having an impact on the actual economic development of these countries, sometimes bringing them back by decades. By comparison, the Hurricane Katrina in the U.S., you look at the trajectory of economic development, it had no impact whatsoever. And it was, at what, $200 billion or whatever it was, it doesn't really compare. The average cyclone in the Pacific Islands, however, has, a cost of, has been estimated around $75 million. It's not small money for these countries. So we definitely see climate change, adaptation, and the ability to manage the risk of disaster as at the core of the economic and social development of small island states and the Pacific Islands in particular. And this is an important point because if this is understood and embraced as a concept, governments and donors would be willing to address it in a more strategic and sustainable way.
What kind of adaptation measures are you talking about? Can you give an example of, say, somewhere like Kiribati?
Yes. Kiribati is a particular case because it is maybe the most extreme case that we have in the Pacific. Is an atoll country, so is a strip of land, no elevation, 3 or 4 meters of elevation. At the widest point is 450 meters. So it's a strip of land with a main road cutting through and villages and communities on the side. It's spread over 33 atolls. Altogether, it must be 100,000 people, but in a vast ocean, as big as the United States or Europe. So the challenges there, from a climate change perspective, are associated with sea level rise and the impact of storm surges and inundation from the sea. So adaptation measure for a country like Kiribati really deal mostly with securing the availability and quality of drinking water. Atolls have a very thin water lens underneath that can easily get contaminated by pollution in general, human as well, but also by saline intrusion. And coastal protection, because they don't really have a lot of space where to go. So Kiribati is also the country where we have had the longest engagement with the government. And it's an interesting case. It's not been a very easy program to develop and to implement, in part because Kiribati is also a very vulnerable country in many other ways. It's geographically is far from anywhere else, very dependent on remittances from abroad, from donor support. They don't have a lot of natural resources and economic basis to build their economic growth, besides fisheries. And therefore, And in addition, actually, I should add, the capacity, the local human capacity is constrained. And that's maybe the biggest constraint that we had in working in Kiribati. Said that is a country that has taken the issue of climate change, adaptation, and disaster management very seriously. The government is committed to it at the highest level, which we think is a precondition for actually working around issues of climate change and disaster, because these are multi-sectoral issues. They go across sector, they have a long span. You really have to be committed to improving the conditions over time and not just, over the next 3 or 4 or 5 years of political cycle. So you do require the government commitment. But the capacity building aspect of it is pretty dominant in these countries. Adaptation measure, you were saying, okay, yes. Water, coastal protection, but if you expand, agriculture is an important aspect, health, which is somehow related to water often, or health related to heat and climate change diseases, but in the case of Kiribati, it's mostly because of water.
In decades to come, is it fair to say that Kiribati is a bit of a lost cause, that the damage has gone too far? Is it?
Well, yes and no. Yes, in the sense that certainly this is a fair question, and I think the government itself in Kiribati, the government of Kiribati, has actually taken that question seriously and has taken the position that a viable solution is for the Kiribati population, the younger population, to get a better education and be able to move away. And it's happening, and it's happening with the support of the international community. But this poses a lot of other questions as well. First, there is a significant part of the population that would not be able to do this. The older people, they just don't want to leave. And culturally and socially is not really something that they would consider. We also have an obligation to think about what is happening between now and then. And I think there is quite a bit that can be done to increase the country's resilience to the impact of climate change. And so, but certainly, relocation and even, evacuation is considered in many of the atoll countries and small island states. And is a very drastic measure, which has social, human, legal implications. So it's not at all a strange question. I'm not sure we have the answers yet.
Perhaps both of you or all of you can talk to this a bit, but the notion, and Norman, you touched on this, the idea that people find the natural disasters compelling or, want to give at that time. How do you get around trying to get this long-term planning of adaptation in place?
Well,
Milina.
I think one point that we should make, which I think Norman touched upon, is that when a disaster strikes, everybody, in most cases, everybody is moved and wants to do something, and the response is usually quite impressive in terms of helping and supplying assistance and so on. However, in the longer term, that's not a terribly sustainable option, especially because, as I said, every disaster brings the country back in their economic growth path instead of forward, displaces resources from other uses. And one point of our work in the Pacific, which is actually well received to some extent by the countries, is that a lot needs to be done prepare before the disaster strikes. That's where more focus should be. It's what we call managing the risk of disaster or reducing the risk of disaster. And if you take that approach, then I think you're more likely to see this long-term sustainability.
I'd like to say you're absolutely right. People get moved, and the compassion. It's capturing that compassion, capturing those people. For instance, in Pakistan, UNICEF have something like 30,000 new people who've never donated before. Now, it's our job to nurture that and to introduce some of these programs, to encourage people to become, in our terms, and every charity has its own version of this, a global parent, someone who pledges each month, so that we can explain to them that these development projects are ongoing. And I think, developed nations have an obligation to become that kind of donor to sustain these long-term projects and give when there is mega natural disasters as well. People you find will do both. But so much of it depends upon awareness and education. I think it's very low level yet about what we're talking about today.
Martijn, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, sure. I think, one of the things which you've hit on is that climate change as an issue is a very complicated issue. So we have the first challenge that a lot of people are still debating the impacts of climate change and to what extent it's actually happening, although we would hope that most of the world has accepted that. Secondly, the consequences of climate change are very diverse, and we're talking everything from increase in emissions, species loss, through to nations disappearing, refugees from the Pacific. We've had a lot of talk about going to New Zealand, and so these issues are very, very complicated. And so we've got to deal with them on two levels. Three levels really. One is actually preventing climate change impacts from happening. Secondly is mitigating their impacts, and a lot of the focus has been on that. And then finally, adaptation. And to some extent, the sort of aid the emergency aid you're talking about is a fast and quick response to an immediate issue that has arisen, as opposed to the long-term shifts that we have in really getting global finance in to try to manage both the reduction of emissions, but at the same time deal with the impacts of climate change, particularly where it's possible to use those for the benefit of delivering good social outcomes in developing and least developed countries. And if you just have a look historically what's happened, early on when climate change became quite a key issue, the World Bank, for example, through their carbon finance business, although they were looking at adaptation issues, started by raising funds from largely polluters and developed country governments to help fund projects in developing countries that could have both reduce emissions as well as delivering social outcomes. So, for example, if you're in areas in a particular country which traditionally has been powered by diesel generators, you might move towards solar or renewable energy. You put that in, it provides a much more reliable energy source to local communities, which has other benefits, and it also reduces emissions. And what those funds would do is it would then take the benefit of the carbon and then trade that on the international market and use that finance to fund it. So what we've seen is that around the world we've seen governments in developed countries develop what in effect are obligations to reduce emissions with the ability to buy an offset from a project in a developing country, and then those large scale polluters in developed countries can then use those offsets to reduce their emissions. Now, that is sort of a private means of financing reduction in emissions, but it's really, to a large extent, still tinkering on the edges. And one of the challenges we're seeing at the moment is that with a lot of these projects, they started off being very large scale, like the reduction of HFC 23 gases in China from large industrial plants. And a lot of those projects are now being called into question, which is calling into question the whole sort of Kyoto Protocol mechanism around these offset projects. And that has resulted in hesitation in the private sector to invest in this area, which sees a sort of a shift back at the moment to the public sector finance. So just to give you a few examples of that, One of the projects which we have been quite involved in India is with solar cooktops, where traditionally in a house, a family would cook with a small stove using firewood. It would create an enormous amount of pollution in the home. Women who are in the home cooking would really suffer the effects of that pollution. By switching to other sorts of cooktops that are either solar powered upon the roof and don't generate all of the smoke, you get much better health incomes. You reduce health effects, and you also reduce the carbon emissions. And through using microfinance and other measures to do that, you can sort of get outcomes that are fairly broad and across a large area of the population fairly quickly. But the interesting thing is what we're seeing at the moment with the uncertainty in global regulatory frameworks around the reduction in emissions, with the sort of the slowdown in negotiating another international agreement to curb emissions, is governments in developed countries actually stepping in. So if you just take one area, which is avoided deforestation. So one of the big issues we have in developing countries is large areas of forest being chopped down, the timber being sold, and it is a significant global problem. And as a result of that, the international community is working towards developing a set of rules by which if somebody doesn't chop down a rainforest, they can get reward through credits, and those credits can be used by buyers in developed countries. Now, one of the issues with the REDD is that there's all this uncertainty as to how those rules will develop, and in the short term, there's no incentive for somebody to go and stop somebody logging down a forest, simply to pay them for saving the environment. So while those rules are trying to do that, we have this gap where there is nothing at the moment. So what we're seeing governments in the West step in to try to fund this. So for example, Norway's, just with some other countries, has pledged $4 billion to Indonesia to try to prevent their rainforest being chopped down. And interestingly, the US has pledged $1 billion to REDD in Indonesia. The British government has pledged a large amount of money. The Australian government has pledged $200 million in aid for measuring carbon stocks. So we're seeing this sort of very rapid mobilisation of developed country funds into climate mitigation projects around the world, but particularly in the avoided deforestation area. Now that raises interesting issues around your ability to actually prevent deforestation, and the Norwegian attitude has very much been that we can't do things piecemeal anymore. It's no point just starting on one small project, say in Indonesia. We've basically got to take the entire economy and transform it overnight, and the only way to do that is by very, very large-scale public sector finance. But this raises a lot of other interesting issues. So a lot of the funding that we're seeing going into developing countries around climate mitigation is not coordinated. So you've got 4 or 5 countries giving $1 billion or $2 billion to a particular country. There's no real interaction between those donors as to how that money is going to be spent or allocated within that jurisdiction. And another key issue is governance. One of the big issues is in quite a few of these countries, there are real issues around legal governance in terms of ownership of forests, ownership of carbon rights, ownership of environmental rights, as well as legal issues around actual corruption and how you actually manage the money coming into those countries. And there are certain voices in some countries like the US who are saying we shouldn't be sending large pots of money to the more unstable economies to invest in climate change until we know that the governance is right and the money will actually be invested in those projects. So it does raise, I guess the point is that it raises a whole lot of very complex issues, and the real challenge is working out how best we can mobilise international finance, both not just on an emergency aid basis but on a long-term sustainable basis, to actually successfully implement projects on the ground in developing countries.
Fascinating. I'd like to open up to questions from the audience now. Yep, over here.
Okay, Julian Lacow from Bradman Energy and Carbon Recruitment. Considering that the IMF strategy in the 80s and 90s to basically promote some countries to specialize in some specific products, and considering that those strategies have definitely failed, and considering that the challenge is not really technical in terms of poverty and climate change, but more financial and political, what's your view, guys, on one, the idea of just cancelling the debts of the least developed countries, not the developing countries, but the least developed countries? And second, to organize a taxation on world financial transaction, like some people are promoting or have been promoting for many years, in order to fund action for in order to get more funding for international institutions like the UN, the World Bank, or the IMF, and to make sure that this new source of funding can help us financing CDM projects or education projects or whatever.
I mean historically, as you know, there has been a mechanism called debt for nature swaps, where debt was forgiven in return for protection of nature. In some of this funding I'm talking about in red, there is that mechanism being put on the table that we will forgive national debt in return for protecting rainforests. So that is clearly a mechanism that can be employed, and that obviously the debt spiral is a key issue of poverty that needs to be avoided. Your issue about a global financial a tax on global financial transactions is one that has also been put on the table, and this comes down to what is the best and most efficient way to raise money for dealing. Is it through an emissions trading scheme? Is it through a carbon tax? And we have these debates here. Well, and they'll go on in other countries, but it is one of the issues I know that was put at the G20 meeting, and it may be a very simple, effective way to do it. It's easy to have that discussion when we're not in a GFC. It's more difficult to have that discussion when when we're outside of that. And then finally, you've raised an interesting question about who manages that money. You do see, and this is a challenge, that in a lot of developing countries, there is a debate about who should manage the money, and if overseas aid comes, how is that best managed, or if there's a raising of a global tax in the way that you're saying it goes in. There are significant issues between sovereignty here and between how you actually invoke that expenditure on the ground. So our experience has been that a lot of the least developing countries, there is great suspicion of multilateral institutions, of the IFM, the IFC.
Because of the history?
Yeah, because of the history, and there is also a reluctance to allow them to manage the money. And when you talk, my discussions with some of the major developing country donors is that they just want to donate the money, but they do not want to dictate how it's used on the ground for sovereignty reasons. But that then raises issues that there are other donor countries who are very, very stringent about how the money must be used. And so if we do give money to somebody for an avoided deforestation project, it needs to be spent on that, not on something totally unrelated or just disappear. So I think those are some of the challenges.
If I could just add to that, some of those numbers are very scary, the size of them, and really, on the ground, the effectiveness of them. Do they actually get down to the grassroots level? And I think NGOs have a big part to play in that. And I think another role that's starting to come around, and as the GFC recovers, is corporate social responsibility. And it's heartening to see some of those now attacking global issues, saying our aim is to eradicate polio. The Kiwanis are doing postnatal tetanus. Rotary is doing polio. People are actually taking a huge issue and using their own governance, as it were, to get that right. Bill Gates is challenging his peers to come up with this huge fund. These are not insignificant projects, because I think the way they're implemented sometimes are perhaps more effective in targeted areas than these huge amounts of money that are just poured into developing countries.
Yeah, although to play devil's advocate for a moment, I think that is correct, but the challenge is the climate problem is so significant that we need some real circuit breakers. So while all of these small-scale initiatives are very important and they're critical, and when you add them all up en masse, the more we can do, it will definitely make a difference. If you take an attitude like Norway on the red approach, they're saying the entire rainforests of Indonesia are at risk. At the moment, if you have a rainforest area, somebody is coming to you and saying, if you allow us to chop it down, you will get revenue tomorrow. So they've got to basically substitute the forestry revenue source or the mining revenue source with another revenue source, which is really environmental products. And so what they're really saying is, we'll pay you not to sell trees, and it's going to cost us $4 billion, or however much it's going to cost. And we've got to do it across the country in one hit. And then the question is, how do you manage that money, and how do you put that money into community programs? And that's, I think, to some extent, the philosophy that you struggle with, balancing these sort of issues of very large-scale action very quickly. And I mean, I would say, unfortunately, in your question about Kiribati, I think it may just well be too late, because we ask, if you take predictions of global sea level rise and storm surges in the long term, it will be. There has to be. There's no room for adaptation.
Milina?
Well, I'd like to give a little bit of a perspective back to the Pacific Island countries, because what we are facing, at least at the moment, is not so much lack of financial resources as much as the ability to use these resources effectively in country. And I actually didn't detect so much a dislike vis-a-vis international agencies, as long as we ourselves are able to tailor our interventions to the needs and the context of the country. And by context, I mean the social, economic, and logistic or whatever. So it depends. These are very small countries. The needs are significant, but they're manageable with the amount of resources that are made available through the international donor community. What the countries themselves are struggling with is where to invest this money, where to put it. And I think I take your point earlier on that in tailoring our interventions to the needs of these countries, we have to use approaches that are innovative, but by innovative I mean sometimes simple and basic, and trying to work at government level, because you need that kind of support and long-term commitment, but also at local level, at community level, and at people's level. And that's where we have to, as agencies, adjust maybe a little bit our intervention and partner with those groups that are able to work at grassroots level.
Oh, we've got a question here from Port Moresby or Dili?
From Port Moresby. I think it's addressed to Martijn. What are some requirements that developing countries need to adhere to in order to qualify for funding for our EED projects? And it's from Nasayu Lurang in Port Moresby.
I think at the moment the requirements for a country to get RED funding, it is not something that's been resolved at the international level, and the issue around the rules around RED, we hope or expect may be clarified in Cancun at the end of the year, the next COP. But at the moment, it's very much been two things have happened. The private sector has decided, and particularly environmental NGOs have decided to invest in projects in countries that are really most at risk from avoided deforestation. Norway partly chose Indonesia, in part because of the relationship and because of the fact that it has a very exposed at risk deforestation issue. Not to say that other countries don't, but Norway's also put money into Brazil in a different sort of model. So I think at the moment there's a little bit of experimentation. But when you ask people to invest in a country around RED, they want to have things in place such as clear legal title to the carbon, making sure you can work out who owns the forests, making sure it can be protected over time, those sorts of issues to make sure that it is possible to do that. But I think at a global level, people will start with those areas of rainforest that are most at risk. So if you have a country where a lot of the rainforest is very well protected as national park, it's not at risk of logging, it's not an area where RED funding will go. So I think, and in the case of Papua New Guinea, there has been a significant amount of private sector and NGO engagement. The Nature Conservancy has done a number of RED projects in PNG, and that is quite a strong focus. Obviously, the politics in PNG around RED have been quite difficult of late, and those do need to be resolved. But PNG did make a significant mark for itself at the last COP when Kevin Conrad, who was a representative of the Rainforest Alliance, got up at the COP and told the United States to either start negotiating or get out of the room. And basically that was a circuit breaker at that COP. Sorry, 2 years ago at Bali. So I think we need to see how the rules will develop and how things will pan out over the coming sort of months at the end of the year. Just one other comment, just based on what we were saying before. I think one of the things that you do see here, which is critical, is that in dealing with climate change, the action has to be both at a ground level up and at a developing country level down. And it really is doing everything we can all across the spectrum to try to get these on-the-ground projects happening and to prove that they can have a range of benefits. And it's about education and culture. And a lot of the on-the-ground projects you're talking about, and like the cook stoves, etc., are all about educating change, really.
Fiona Wayne, Environment Business Australia. Two of the words, the phrases that kept on cropping up are long-term and cost and economics. And I think if we looked at the long term, rather like a marathon, it's not when you reach the finish gate that counts, it's getting over the starting gate and really convincing people that the need to start is now because of the scale and the sheer mass of what's coming up with climate change. But then linking maybe climate change with food security and fuel security as well. And I know, all of us have spent a lot of time talking about REDD and forestry and deforestation avoided. But what about soil carbon and the FAO projects to rebuild soil carbon and agricultural productivity put into that mix and at a scale that really can attract sufficient investment in a way that people aren't seeing this as a cost, but as a really massive investment that has short, mid and long-term benefits.
Certainly that's the approach that we would like to see, where you make these links, where climate change is not being seen as a separate issue from economic development and is actually seen as an opportunity to some extent to do more of what is good and what should be done anyway in many of these countries. The poorer countries are already under a lot of pressure, and that could be food security or energy security. This certainly applies for the Pacific, very much so. So we do see also an opportunity in this new financial structure and flow of funding to bring these countries, around broader issues of economic development. Not easy, but certainly possible.
And unfortunately, major tragedies sometimes are the trigger for getting this to happen. So Pakistan will need to be completely rebuilt. That economy is going to be looking quite different. And indeed in Cambodia, it's a mono economy. It's just rice growing. It's got to be developed and sophisticated and made less vulnerable, I guess. But unfortunately, it is usually the larger disasters which triggers this to happen.
I think there's also a cultural challenge there in a lot of developing countries where a way of life and the way you live and farming and and what you do has been the way it's always been done. For a new generation to simply come along and say we're going to change that is quite confronting. And so often it's about saying, look, we can do what we've always done, we can continue to do certain practices, but we can adapt that, or because circumstances have changed, or because, because there are other opportunities, and it's an education process, and working on the ground with communities to do that. I think it's sort of wrong for us to assume that you can always get, traditional cultures to simply just change the way they do things because there's a better way.
We have another question from the video conference in Timor.
Yep, this is for Milina. It's from Nicholas Molinus from the Ministry of Agriculture in Timor-Leste. And he says, here in Timor-Leste, we are focusing on mitigation and adaptation, specifically the increase in temperature and maybe rainfall and their impact on food security. What has worked in other Pacific Island countries?
What has worked may be a little bit too much of a question, but certainly is an aspect that has been looked at in many, many countries. In fact, I would say that food security is probably ranking among the first priorities in most national action plan for adaptation. There are challenges, however, in addressing I would say there have been pilots across several countries from which we can learn. And I think the aspect that Martin raised of introducing new methods is a challenge, is not so easy. When you look at the impact of climate change in agriculture, you're bringing in several aspects. You're bringing in science on genetics, way of the method, the practices, and you want to find also a good balance between traditional practices and new technology or innovation. We ourselves have not addressed climate change in agriculture in the Pacific, but I know the UNDP has done several pilots on this. I must say that the implementation of the national action plans for adaptation started only a few years ago. So I think there is quite a bit on paper, but not necessarily on the ground. So we may need to see a little bit, we need to wait a little bit to see what is actually working in the context of the Pacific.
Jack Whelan from the Foundation for Development Cooperation. I wonder if I could just ask for a moment to make a comment on that last question as well, because the Foundation for Development Cooperation that I'm associated with is very involved in a program with the Asian Development Bank called the Energy for All Partnership. And we've been doing a lot of work in Timor-Leste, because the big issue there is not just deforestation that Martijn's been talking a lot about, but the degradation that results as a result of deforestation. And Timor-Leste is experiencing a terrible problem of degradation as a result of the fact that they're really exhausting their firewood supplies, and the whole economy for the poor people really revolves around collecting and selling firewood. One of the critical factors there as an adaptation measure is to re-establish those forests, but to find another way of fueling their cooking and heating and other activities. And one of the things that we've been working on is LPG. Now that's not, it's a fossil fuel, it's not a renewable energy, but it's a much cleaner and more efficient fuel, and as a transition to something that's perhaps more renewable is very valuable. And learning the lesson of a country like Indonesia, which has undertaken a massive, as Martijn was describing, a nationwide program of substitution of kerosene to LPG as a major contributor towards building in a program of transition towards cleaner, more efficient and less carbon-emitting fuels. So I think Timor-Leste could learn and could adapt a lot of those programs that are going on elsewhere. The question I'm coming to is Martijn's comment before, which was that many of the challenges revolve around the way in which large and NGOs and other small development agencies can perhaps work more effectively together, because one gets the impression that this is an inherent problem in the way in which a lot of these projects and initiatives are financed. There's not enough collaboration that goes on between all the different multilateral and other development agencies. Perhaps you could just comment on whether you think you've got any proposals about how that could be more successfully overcome.
Look, coming quite new to this area, we see how effective on the ground in emergencies cooperation is through the new cluster agreement between agencies. And really, I think that model has got to be adapted over to some of these mega generic projects, so that we do work as a cluster, we do share a lot more. It's not been natural to do that. And I guess that surprised me from coming in from the business sector, that there isn't more cooperation and coordination. I think UNICEF are starting to talk that way. Tony Lake, the new CEO, is very much of that view. He's very much of the view that this is all about equity now. This is all about taking the bottom 20% who disappear in the averages but are actually making no progress, and the only way to do that is to combine forces. So I would love to see that cluster approach that we use in Pakistan used in developing countries.
Coordination or weak coordination or lack of coordination comes up all the time, certainly in the Pacific context, and is weak coordination among donor partners and weak coordinations among other agencies, NGOs, and so forth. This is particularly evident now in the climate change arena because of the increased amount of funding. And what happens is that many activities, at least so far, have been driven by where the funding is coming from, and tends to be on an ad hoc pilot basis. The donor community is certainly aware of it, and we're trying to work around common approaches. I sense that the same is happening also in the non-government organization world. Certainly, it does help if you have governments that can lead that process and not let it in the hands of agencies or other institutions. And that may be, it's a hope because it's not really quite happening. But I think it would be much more effective if we were able to work together around a program that the country owns, that is driven by their needs, and for that we have to accept that they may need help for that as well. But it's the approach that we are trying to follow at the moment.
Martijn, would you like to add anything?
I was just going to say, I think it's also a slightly bigger issue in the sense that it's also when funding and assistance is announced, and we do it very well in the emergency aid context, how you actually get it out there. So one of the criticisms at the moment is that a significant amount of money has been pledged through the UNICEF process to adaptation mitigation, yet it just hasn't appeared yet. So it's having a process whereby that money does actually gets committed, gets put out fairly quickly. And I think it's also about a lot of governments taking a step back and saying this is not about self-interest. So, I mean, we saw a lot of governments doing capacity building work within the Asia region purely for the purpose of getting access for their companies to the CDM. And I could tell you a number of countries in Asia where 6 or 7 governments have done the same capacity building project to teach people on how to do CDM projects in that country over an 18-month period, and they just continuously roll it out. And it is a waste of resources and money, when that money could be much better spent on perhaps other issues connected with climate change in the jurisdiction. So I think you just do need quite a different approach to try to resolve it.
We had a question.
Yes. I'm Kirk Hoffman. I'm the honorary curator of the Vanuatu Culture Centre in Vanuatu, and I'm on the scientific committee of the Museum of Tahiti and the Islands in Tahiti, and a research associate at the Australian Museum just down the road. I just want to say something from the point of view of traditional cultures in Vanuatu. We had a meeting at the end of 2006 down on the island of Tanna. Now, they're very aware about climate change. Now, when things happen in Melanesian cultures, nothing happens by accident. It's always caused by something or somebody. The chiefs decided at the end of the meeting who was responsible or what's responsible for climate change. And the decision was, fault below white man. It's the white man's fault, or the fault of modern development. These are people who had never been to school. And in the meeting, there was hardly anybody wearing any clothes. They refused clothes. They refused to use modern money. They refused education. But they're very happy and very healthy. No one's in debt. They're not wrong. What they're saying is it's the white man's world or modern development that is responsible for all this. And in Melanesian traditional cultures, if you find somebody who's responsible for something, what you do is you ask them politely to get up and apologize and pay a fine, usually pay a fine in pigs or money mats or shell money. It might be an idea for some of the big institutions in the modern world to actually think about that. Because, as Milina was saying, the cultures that are going to be really hard hit by a lot of this sort of stuff are cultures out in the Pacific now who have nothing whatsoever to do with this. And so it's a moral obligation on behalf of the white man's world or the modern world or whatever to fund all. As in 2008, I was out in an area in northern Vanuatu speaking with chiefs about sea level rise. And one of the chiefs said, hey, but if the sea does come up like that, how am I going to move my big wooden slit drums to higher ground, to another island? And I said, hire a boat. Sorry, Milina. I said, tell the captain to send the bill to the World Bank. Because, all these big institutions have actually been funding or promoting the wrong kinds of economic ideals. What it actually needs is a change in development.
We're just about out of time. I don't mean to cut you off.
Yes, look, another thing. Okay. Why is the
Very quickly.
We're talking about climate change. Why is the World Bank in the last fiscal year just invested $4.4 billion US dollars in funding coal-fired power stations? There's a report out in last Wednesday's The Guardian newspaper in the UK.
I would like to get an answer to the question.
What you're saying is absolutely right. I mean, no one can debate what you've said. You're spot on, and it comes down to political leadership around the world and countries being able to change. And the World Bank's not alone in funding coal power stations. Other development banks around the world are doing that as well at the moment. But the reality is we need to have we need global commitment to make significant change very quickly. So there's no, at the moment we're in this political argument. I mean, while some countries like Norway are prepared to say we have a responsibility, the OPEC countries at the meeting in Copenhagen didn't particularly shine on that issue when they objected to doing that. So there's a major global political problem which we're now facing the future of mankind about whether or not we want to actually take action on climate change and do something, or whether we just, we're not going to do anything.
But sorry if I can add, but there is also the issue of developing countries that are both emitters contributing to emissions and vulnerable to climate change. And those are the countries where the biggest challenges are, because it's really hard. And I sympathize with these countries when they say they want to have the right to grow economically. And that comes with, tough choices that may not be the best for the environment or globally. And you have to engage in discussion with them. And I think to some extent the World Bank is caught in this discussion, because for these countries you have to probably go for a compromise. You cannot have I don't know with which moral authority, rich countries can tell a developing country, no, you're not going to develop because your development is going to, make things worse. You have to work around that. And certainly from an environmental point of view, certain choices of these larger countries are not ideal. But we have to be realistic in the circumstances, and I don't know the details of the China coal fire plants, but I would assume, or certainly I know that some of the discussions were around there are ways of doing things better. They're not, than how they did it before, and that's already an improvement. But these are the real challenges. The real challenges are for these large countries that have such an impact. So it's not black and white. But I do know that we have an internal debate, and I'm not so sure how we're going to end up. We may end up that we stay out of it. I don't know. But
I'd like to thank our live audience here in Sydney, and also our audience in Dili and Port Moresby, and especially those on our panel, Martijn Wilder, Milina Battaglini and Norman Gillespie. Hopefully you'll join us for the next Praxis next month, and if you'd like to subscribe to the podcast or watch episodes online, go to worldbank.org/Praxis. Thank you. Goodbye.